Dr. Goodall, your story is so inspiring for me, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, I'm very happy to have this opportunity. And there's so much really to say. I mean, I've been on this planet 85 years, so I've had many experiences, and trying to pick out the ones to share is always a challenge. But I think as we're talking about making change, it has to go back to when I was a very little girl. And I was growing up actually in the house where I am in now. This is where I've been grounded during the pandemic. I was very lucky. I was actually caught when I was at home, surrounded by all my things. I was nearly caught in Abu Dhabi, which wouldn't have been very easy. But anyway, luckily I was here. And I was fortunate in having an amazing, supportive mother. And I want to emphasize this because that's been one of the most important influences in my whole life. So I was actually born loving animals. People say, where did that begin? Where did your love of nature begin? I don't know. Somehow in the womb, I think, or maybe before that. But anyway, I, was born in London, but grew up here in Bournemouth because the war began, World War II. And so Mum and my sister and me came to live with her mother, my grandmother. And there's not many exciting animals around here, but there were all the birds. And of course, there were so many more birds and so many more insects when I was growing up than there are now. That's a whole other story. But anyway, I was always out watching animals, making birds lose their fear of me so that I could watch them feed their babies, and then the babies fly away, spending every minute I could outside. But when I was growing up, there was no TV. A lot of young people find that hard to imagine. It hadn't been invented. We had 2 channels on the radio, I think, and that was it. We called it the wireless because it was very exciting to have a piece of equipment that wasn't wired to the wall. That's how different the world was back then. So when I was growing up, I had this wonderful mother who supported me, and I had books and nature. I read a lot of books. I learned from books. And it was because of reading Dr. Dolittle, and probably many of you have never read Dr. Dolittle, but do try and read the story of Dr. Dolittle because it's wonderful. And then I found Tarzan of the Apes. And I think it was those 2 books that started my love of Africa. And I started reading every book I could about Africa. They came from the library. We had very little money. We couldn't afford to buy books. And anyway, I doubt if children's books were made in the war. So it was when I was 10 years old that I announced that I would grow up, go to Africa, live with wild animals and write books about them. Well, here comes the need for change, because at that time, first of all, girls didn't go into scientific careers. Secondly, nobody was going out into the wilds and studying animals, almost nobody. It was something that was different. So everybody laughed at me. How would I possibly get to Africa? I mean, it was far away. We didn't have money. It was possibly dangerous. And anyway, I was just a girl. But you see, here's where my mother came in and played such an important role, because she said, Jane, if you really want something like this, you're going to have to work extraordinarily hard. You'll have to take advantage of every opportunity. And then if you don't give up, maybe you'll find a way. So that was such an important message for me to have when I was young. And I kept that with me. When I left school, I did well at school, didn't like it much. I preferred being outside, but I did well in all my exams, but there was no money for university and you couldn't get scholarships back then. So I had to get money. So boring old job in London, first of all, doing a secretarial course. And then came the opportunity, a letter from a school friend inviting me to Kenya, where her parents had just bought a farm. Well, it costs money to get, to travel. And again, my mother was amazing. I worked as a waitress in a hotel just around the corner here to get the money because I couldn't save up in London. And, at that time, today it's normal for young women, for students to go off to other countries and have adventures. But back then it didn't happen. But it was amazing that I was just 23, which is probably like a 16-year-old today, certainly in the US. And I was 23 and she let me go off on my own on a boat. And I think it was during that voyage that I learned a lesson that informed a lot of the way I think. The first place we touched African soil, and I set foot on African soil, was Cape Town. We had to go all the way around the Cape because there was a war with Egypt at the time and the Suez Canal was closed. And it's beautiful there. Some of you may have seen it. And it was exciting. I was in Africa. But then I noticed on the backs of the seats and the hotel doors were these words in Afrikaans, which I was told meant white people only. And that was a shock because I didn't grow up that way. Because my grandfather, I never met him, he died before I was born, but he brought us up to judge people not by the color of their skin or anything like that, but as people. So I couldn't wait to leave Cape Town. I think we were there 2 days while the ship got restocked. And getting to Kenya was much better because they were just about to become independent from British colonial rule. Stayed with my friend, but then heard about Dr. Louis Leakey, famous paleontologist. And somebody said, Jane, if you're interested in animals, then you should meet Louis. He was curator of the Natural History Museum. And I went to see him and I was ready for this. First of all, 2 days before I met him, his secretary had suddenly quit and he needed a secretary. That boring old secretarial course, there I was. So you never know when something which you may not feel is particularly wonderful, maybe it'll come in useful. So there I was in this world of people who could answer all my questions about the mammals and the birds and so on. And I was ready for it because that first meeting, he took me around and asked me so many questions. And because I had spent every minute I could reading everything I could find about African animals, and there wasn't that much, I think he was very impressed. So I was ready for this moment, this momentous moment when I met Louis and he gave me a job. And I think he continued to be impressed by what I knew and how passionate I was, because he suddenly asked if I would be prepared to go and study and live with and learn from not any animal, but the one most like us. And of course, yes. Well, it was a struggle to get the money. He managed to get money for 6 months, but I hadn't been to college. I was just out from England. Well, actually, I had to go back while he searched for money. It took a year. And during that time, I tried to learn as much as I could about chimpanzees, but there was very little to learn. Nobody studied them in the wild. Few studies in captivity, a few sad individuals in zoos. That was about it. But anyway, I finally, he got the money. And again, my amazing mother, the British authorities wouldn't allow me to go into the forest alone. And so it was Mum who volunteered to come for 4 of the 6 months. And I don't think many mothers would have done that, because at that time, Gombe National Park in Tanzania was very wild, very remote. It took a long time to get from our little camp into the nearest little town. And yet she came, and she was a huge support because in the early days, the chimps ran away as soon as they saw me. And I was getting depressed and time was running out. And then fortunately, after 4 months, one chimpanzee began to lose his fear. And it was so sad that my mother left just 2 weeks before this one chimpanzee, David Greybeard, and here he is, because he played a very important role in my life. And I saw him using grass stems to use and make tools. He made the tools by picking leafy twigs and picking off the leaves. And at that time, Western science thought that humans and only humans used and made tools. So that was what enabled Leakey to bring in the National Geographic Society, and they sent a photographer, filmmaker, Hugo van Lauwijk, who I subsequently married, to record the behavior of the chimps. And thanks to David, the other chimps began to lose their fear. I could get close. I got to know them as individuals. I was amazed by how like us their behavior was: kissing, embracing, holding hands, swaggering, males competing for dominance, good mothers and bad mothers. And they are capable of violence and brutality, but also love and altruism. So after 2 years, Leakey told me I had to get a degree. He said I would need to stand on my own 2 feet. He couldn't always be there getting money for me. And he said, we don't have time for you to get an undergraduate degree. I've got your place in Cambridge University in England to do a PhD in ethology. I didn't even know what ethology meant. No Googling in those days. Well, it's just studying behavior. But anyway, I was very nervous when I got to Cambridge. And it was in Cambridge that my first real task of making change happened. Because to my horror and dismay, the scientists, or many of them, told me I'd done everything wrong. I shouldn't have given the chimpanzees names. They should have had numbers. I couldn't talk about them having personalities or minds or emotions because those were unique to us. But I'd been taught by, here is another of my very special mentors. This is my dog, Rusty. I spent so much of my childhood with Rusty. In fact, I would never have gone to Africa except that he died. I couldn't have left him. The bond was too strong. It would have been betrayal. But my years with him had taught me the professors are wrong. Of course, animals have personalities, minds, and emotions. And so, because also Mum had always taught me that if you think differently from someone, first listen to them, because maybe they've know things that you don't, so you must listen. But if at the end of that you still think that you're, well, righter than they are, then you should have the courage of your conviction. So I stood up for the fact that I believed animals had personalities, minds, and emotions. And because chimpanzees are so like us biologically, so we share 98.6% of their DNA. And in addition, was all the material that I was writing about their behavior and Hugo's film. And the scientists in the end simply had to move away from this reductionist way of thinking that we humans are the only sentient beings on the planet, that we're different. I was told that there was a difference in kind between us and the other animals. But so anyway, that didn't change suddenly, but gradually it has changed. And now any of you young people who wanted to study animal personality, animal intelligence, absolutely, but even animal emotions, you can study that in university. That's how much we've changed. And I thank the chimpanzees for that, and Leakey for getting me to study them. At any rate, while I was out there with the chimpanzees, I got my PhD and went back and built up a research station. And I could spend hours out in the rainforest learning about the interconnection of all living things and how each little species has a role to play in this tapestry of life. And I left when there was a conference at which we had a session where by then the scientists from 6 different field study sites who've been learning about chimps, we got them together for the first time. And it was mostly to learn about how chimp behavior differs from one environment to another and learn about their different cultures, because they have culture, which is behavior passed from one generation to the next through observation, imitation, and practice. But we had a session on conservation, shocking. Right across Africa, there were forests disappearing. Somebody's dog heard me talking about Rusty, perhaps. So forests were disappearing, chimpanzee numbers were decreasing. And as I say, I was shocked. We also had a session on conditions in captive situations like medical research labs. And that was even worse. Our closest relatives who can live for 60 years in 5-foot by 5-foot cages. And there were also a session on some of the terrible conditions in the zoos. So I left that meeting, having gone as a scientist, I left as an activist, knowing I had to do something. I didn't know what to do. So the first thing I did was force myself to go into those medical research labs, because you can't talk about something meaningfully unless you see it with your own eyes. And unlike the animal rights people of that time, who would confront somebody working in the lab, telling them that what they're doing is wicked and bad and evil, you can't change minds that way. So I got together with them and sat down, and instead of accusing them of being cruel, give them the benefit of the doubt, maybe they're ignorant, I showed them film of the chimps at Gombe. Let them think in their own heart the difference between how a chimpanzee should live and how they were living in their medical research labs. And that's been a long fight, but it started way back then, 1987, when gradually in the labs they began to introduce some of the things to make the chimps' lives a bit better, like enriching them, giving them problems to solve so that they don't suffer from this terrible boredom, and many other changes, which I won't go into. And the same thing in the zoos, starting our program, which is still going on today, enriching the lives of chimps in zoos, improving conditions, training the caregivers. And then Africa, to raise some money, went to 6 different range countries to learn a bit more about what was going on. And yes, I learned a lot about the problems faced by the chimps, but I also learned about the plight of so many of the African people living in and around chimpanzee habitat, the crippling poverty, lack of health and education facilities, and the degradation of the land. And it came to a head when I flew over the tiny Gombe National Park. When I began in 1960, it was part of a forest belt that stretched right across Africa. When I flew over in a small plane in 1990, yeah, I knew there was deforestation in the area, but I was not prepared to see a little island of forest surrounded by completely bare hills. And that's when it hit me. These people are struggling to survive. There's more than the land can support. They're too poor to buy food from elsewhere. Unless we help them find ways of making a living without destroying the environment, then there's no way we can even try to save the chimpanzees. And so the Jane Goodall Institute was at the forefront of what we now call community-based conservation. And our method we call Take Care or Takari. And it started with a tiny group, not of arrogant white people marching into a poor African village and telling them they'd messed things up, but a small group of 7 handpicked local Tanzanians who went and listened to the people and asked them what they thought we could do to make their lives better. And that's where we started. And this program became very holistic. You can look up about it online. I don't have time to go into it. But as we introduced more and more ideas, the people came to trust us. And what began with the 12 villages around Gombe, and included, by the way, very important programs to empower women, microcredit based on Muhammad Yunus's Grameen Bank, and scholarships to keep girls in school during and after puberty, because it's been shown as women's education improves, family size tends to drop. So we provided family planning information, really well received. The women did not want to be just birth machines. And so today that program in Tanzania is throughout the chimp range. It's in 104 villages, and there are volunteers in the villages who come and learn how to use smartphones. They go into their community forests and monitor the health of those forests. And this is tremendously important because most of Tanzania's chimps are not in protected areas. They're in these village forest reserves. So the people have now become our partners in conservation. They understand that protecting the environment is for their own future as well as for wildlife. And that program is now in 6 other African countries. We are ready to scale it up because it's working. Costing money, always money, biggest problem. So by now I'm traveling around the world, giving talks, raising awareness, trying to raise funds, get donors interested. And I kept meeting young people your age, actually, who seem to have lost hope. Most of them just apathetic, not seeming to care about anything much. Some angry, some depressed. And they all said more or less the same, we feel this way because you've compromised our future and there's nothing we can do about it. Well, if you feel that way, you're absolutely right that we have compromised your future. We've been stealing it. We're still stealing it today. But as you all know, you know that there is something that can be done about it. And as I had learned out in the rainforest, that every species has a role to play in the tapestry of life, so it is with us. Every individual has a role to play in this extraordinary thing that we call life on planet Earth. So Roots and Shoots, from the beginning, had as its main motto, mantra, whatever you want to call it, that every individual, every one of us, makes an impact every single day, and we get to choose what sort of impact we make. If we alleviate poverty, because if you're really poor, you cannot have the luxury of choosing. Probably all of you can choose what you buy, more or less. You can ask, did this harm the environment? Did it cause cruelty to animals, like meat from factory farmed animals? Is it cheap because of child slave labor, or because the people making it in some faraway country were paid less than a living wage? But if you're really poor, you just have to do whatever you can to stay alive. Cut down the last tree to try and grow more food. Fish the last fish. Buy the cheapest junk food just to stay alive. So on the one hand, we have to do something about our unsustainable lifestyles, alleviate poverty, and at least think about what we're going to do with our human population, which is around 5.2 billion of us on the planet today. Sorry, 7.2 billion on the planet today. In 2050, it's reckoned to be almost 10 billion. And already we're running out of natural resources in some places faster than nature can replenish them. So those are the tasks that face young people today. But with Roots and Shoots, we decided, because of this interconnection of everything, every group between them would tackle 3 projects to help people, 1 to help animals, 1 to help the environment. And not all the members of the group would have to do the same, but they needed to talk about what they were doing and understand how it all interrelates. So it began with 12 high school students in Tanzania in 1991. It's now in 65 countries, actually more than that, but some groups we don't even know about. And it's growing all the time, hundreds and thousands of groups, kindergarten, university students, even older young people. We've had the program in prisons, in the staff of a big business, for example. And the great thing is there's all what I call the alumni, those who've been through the program, and somehow they retain the values that they acquired during that program. And again, one of those values is to break down the barriers that we build between people of different nations, languages, countries, cultures, religions, between old and young, rich and poor. And understanding that we need everybody in this life. And we mustn't take the attitude that you have to be intelligent and go to university. Not everybody can or wants to go to university. Not everybody needs to go to university. And some people are very content and feel fulfilled with a menial job. We mustn't make them feel that it's not important, because it is, because we need everybody, because everybody has this role to play in this complex web of our human society. And we need to have a different way of thinking about what is a successful life. I'd love it if you young guys talked about that sometime, because at the moment, people mostly think of acquiring wealth, acquiring goods, stuff, more stuff. You know, you're very successful if you have a private plane, you're very successful if you have a couple of yachts and 2 houses and so on. We need to think of how we should measure success. And this COVID-19 pandemic has brought this home to us, because we brought this on ourselves by our disrespect of the natural world, crowding animals together, pushing them in contact with people, creating environments where a virus or a bacteria can jump from an animal to a person, maybe then bond with a cell and make a new disease, which maybe can jump into another human and create an epidemic. And in this case, a pandemic. And this is our disrespect of animals. We kill them, eat them, traffic them. We put them in unhygienic conditions in the African bushmeat markets. We sell them in Latin America. We ship them from different regions and sometimes different countries to the wildlife meat markets of Asia. And in very unhygienic conditions, both the seller and the buyer can be contaminated with blood or urine or feces. And that, in China, we think, led to COVID-19. But there have been other pandemics. HIV/AIDS came from contaminated, people being contaminated by chimpanzee meat in Central Africa. MERS came from domestic camels in the Middle East. And I can't remember how many, but many different diseases we have caught because of the terrible conditions in which animals are kept in these factory farms, which are not only horribly harmful to the environment, but unbelievably cruel. So, as I say, in part, we brought this pandemic on ourselves. And the same disrespect of nature has led to the climate crisis, which we will now face anew when we emerge from the pandemic, as we will. Then a much more serious threat is the climate crisis. So that these lessons I've learned in my life, which I don't have time to share properly, but I thought if I ran through the life, you'd see the different aspects that have come together. And I have been so criticized for thinking too holistically. Jane, you can't do everything, you've got to concentrate. But once you realize about the interconnection of things, you realize you can't just think about and solve one problem, because that is part of another problem, and that's part of another. So you must think holistically. But it came gradually, and as I say, I've lived 85 years, so I've had time to assimilate all these different challenges and do my best with the help of so many young people and people who've helped in my life to solve them. So thank you. That's my story.
That's incredible. Thank you for sharing. I'm amazed that you not only made such an impact yourself, but then empowered so many other people to do the same thing. So one of the things I'd like to ask you is, in your documentary, you explained that when you first got to Tanzania, you actually had no idea what to do. I'm wondering, how did you navigate that ambiguity, and how did you build up the courage to take your first step? Because this is something that I think a lot of the young change makers here have experienced.
Well, it wasn't quite like that, because remember, my goal was to get to Africa. I didn't know how I'd get to study animals, but just getting to Africa was exciting. I was young and it was exciting. And I had the chance to go out into the Serengeti Plains with Louis Leakey and meet lions and rhinos. So all the time I was not worrying too much about the future. I mean, this job with Leakey landed in my lap and I was ready for it. And then he offered me the opportunity to go and study chimpanzees. And of course I said yes. It didn't take courage. It's what I'd wanted to do since I was 10. And I felt that I was on this planet to do just that. And although people have told me I was stupid when I was at Gombe, where at that time there were buffalo and leopard, they've gone now. But I felt, well, I'm meant to be here so they won't harm me. People said, well, that was silly. And I said, well, was it? They didn't harm me. So it wasn't so silly after all, perhaps. I think animals sense, actually.
Absolutely. I'd like to open it up now for the young change makers to ask some questions. So, Mary Catherine, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask, that'd be great.
Hi, I just want to say how inspired I am by all of your work. I mean, you are just incredible. So my question is, as someone who has almost single-handedly enacted systematic change, what do you think is the best way to shift the world's mindset towards climate change so that humans can take meaningful action towards a safer planet?
Well, the way I found most successful in changing minds is telling stories. So, you know, if I'm giving a talk, I usually take people through all the different places I've been and seen the effects firsthand of climate change, like standing with Inuit elders by the ice cliff that leads up to the ice cap, which has dropped so much in the last 10 years. It's unbelievable. But anyway, seeing water gushing out when the elders told me that even in the height of summer, the ice never melted there. Meeting people who've had to leave island homes or homes close to the ocean because of the rising sea levels. I've seen the effects of the terrible droughts, the terrible fires, the flooding, the worst hurricanes and typhoons, and all of that. You know, there's not too many people who look at all that and say, I don't believe in climate change. And then when they say, well, yes, of course, climate's changed, but they have changed throughout evolution. And that's true, the climate has, but always gradually, whereas now it's just racing and it's going too fast for many species to cope. And we're already in the midst of these 6 great extinction. And, you know, partly by our use of pesticides and herbicides and destruction of habitat and all that kind of stuff. So tell people stories. I think the worst thing is to point a finger at them. And especially if you're if you're talking to somebody much older than yourself and you start accusing them, they're just going to withdraw and say, well, I'm not going to let this young person dictate how I think. But you just have to get in here, get into the heart. People have to change from within. And it does work.
Absolutely. And I totally agree with you that storytelling is such a powerful tool to do just that. Why don't we go with Kevin next?
Dr. Goodall, it's truly an inspiration to hear your story, and we all really appreciate it. My question to you is, as a pioneer in a male-dominated field, I'm sure you have dealt with much opposition and many setbacks. So number 1, how did you deal with that? And number 2, what advice would you give us young change makers who are facing similar circumstances?
Well, you see, my life was so different to if I was born today. And I found actually being female was actually a big help. First of all, my whole strong family here, and I didn't introduce my mother who's disappeared. Where is she? I should introduce her since she had such an impact on my life. And, you know, it wasn't just her, but it was her sister and her mother. And so I sort of grew up in the war in a female family. And then when I met Louis Leakey, he didn't tell me at the time, but afterwards he told me that he wanted somebody who hadn't been to college, whose mind wasn't cluttered up with reductionist thinking of the time, but also he felt that women maybe made better observers in the field. He didn't tell me at the time, but he told me later. It's not necessarily true, but you know, women do have some qualities, perhaps innately there, like patience, because throughout evolution, women have had to raise children, and you can't do a good job of that unless you're patient. And so I don't know, maybe we do have some advantage, which doesn't mean that there aren't amazing men. And then when I got to the university, okay, they didn't want to believe in chimpanzee personality, mind, and so on. But that wasn't because I was a female, it was because that wasn't done. So I would have had the same opposition to it, even if I'd been a man. And so anyway, so I explained how I got through that. And then when I first began talking about the tool using and tool making, there were many scientists who said, why should we believe her? She's just a girl and she hasn't been to college. But you see, I was lucky, I didn't care. All I wanted was to get that degree and get back to the forest, which is what I wanted to do. I mean, I was so focused on learning about the chimpanzees. And I think perhaps one bit of advice for people today is, you know, okay, if it's the fact that you're not getting a job and you're being discriminated against like that, then you have to fight it. But fight it in one way, by trying to do really, really well and compete on equal ground, and don't expect to get favors because you're a female. And secondly, some of it, don't worry about it. Just let it roll off you and it'll go away. If you start fighting some of these things that people say, then they get built up and in the end you might lose. So what I love best is a tribe in Latin America. And I think it was, I don't know if it was Panama or Costa Rica, I don't remember, but anyway, an indigenous tribe. And they said, we think of our tribe as an eagle, and one wing is male and one wing is female, and only when the wings are equal shall we fly true. So that is a story which I really love. And we also have to remember that there are certain female qualities that are good. We want them. We shouldn't all be the same. And try and, you know, value the differences and exploit them and use them and make this a better world.
Great. Yeah, what a beautiful image about the eagle. I absolutely love that. Why don't we go with Isha's question next?
Dr. Goodall, I have to say that I greatly enjoyed your speech. I think your story is very inspiring, and I think I learned a lot from hearing about it. So my question to you would be how we as humans should treat animals in an ideal world in order to sustain humanity and the environment. Because in your talk, you talked about how we terribly abuse animals. But what do you think the solution would be?
Well, the solution is to understand that animals were not put in this world for us to use as we wish. And there's a feeling that we're superior to them. It's the same thing that leads to discrimination in people, and people tend to discriminate against animals. Oh, they don't, you know, they don't have feeling. For a long time, people thought they didn't have pain. But now if you look, where is it? Now I've got something here. You have to Google this afterwards, all of you. Because when you see things like this, and can you see what's happening there? That's a pig painting. And she's called Picasso, not Picasso, but Picasso. And you can Google Picasso, and this pig loves painting. She was rescued from slaughter. And so when you look at an animal, you should realize it has feelings like you do. Animals can feel happy and sad. Animals can feel angry. Animals can feel despair, and certainly they can feel pain. And now that we're learning more and more, now that science has opened the door and said, yes, yes, you can go and study these things, we're learning so much about the intellect of, well, crows. Perhaps if you want to see something amazing, just look at some of the videos about crows. And then you can also look at a video which is called 5 Smart Rats. That will amaze you too. Rats turn out to be amazingly intelligent. And then there's the octopus. An octopus has such intelligence you can't imagine. They recognize people. I could tell stories for hours. But what you want to think about when you look at an animal in an ideal world is that it's a being who has a right to live and who is an individual. So when we talk about this factory farming, it's not just cows, it's not just pigs, it's individual cows, it's individual pigs with personalities, and it's their life. Does that answer your question? Or
yes, thank you so much.
Okay.
And I think that's absolutely so relevant in today's world with so much climate change. Just how should we treat animals with respect and dignity? Why don't we go with Isha Patel's question next?
I would just like to start off by saying thank you so much for sharing your inspirational story. My question is that due to the international scope of your work, it requires a lot of travel, and it's what some may call a demanding schedule. And so what has kept you motivated for so many years to continue on with this work?
Well, because it's a battle, it's a constant battle. And, you know, if you look around the world at what we're doing to the environment and each other, you can't help but be depressed. I mean, you can't. And that's why I dislike this phrase, think globally, act locally. Because if you think globally, you're so depressed, you can't act. But if you do like roots and shoots and you do something, I can clean this stream with my friends. I can plant trees. We have a 1 trillion tree challenge now around the world. I can raise money for people suffering from an earthquake. I can go and deliver food to people housebound. I can walk their dogs. I make a difference. And when you see you make a difference, then that gives you, you know, energy. So as I was until now, until lockdown, I was traveling about 300 days a year. And yes, that was using up, you know, flying a lot, which isn't very good for the environment. But on the other hand, you know what's happened because of the pandemic? Tourism has stopped in Africa, and the poaching has gone way up, and animals are being slaughtered partly because people don't have jobs anymore and they go and shoot them to eat them, partly because the rangers very often can't be paid. So the international cartels are zooming in and getting elephant tusks and rhino horn. But anyway, our Roots and Shoots program between them have planted so many millions of trees over the years that I feel that my carbon footprint has been absorbed from the flying. And I've had to fly. I mean, now I'm doing it like this, which maybe, I don't know, but everybody said, well, we've seen you on TV, but it's different when you're here. And people come up after a talk and say, I'd given up hope, but now I've got some hope again, and I promise I'll do my bit. And so that keeps you going, the fact that it is making an impact, it is making a difference. And so I'm also a very obstinate person, and I'm not going to let the Trumps and the Bolsonaros and the Putins win. I'm going to fight for the environment. I'm going to fight for your future.
Wonderful. Why don't we go with Vivian's question next?
Hi, my question is, what do you believe it means to truly live life to the fullest, and how has your journey so far influenced your overall outlook on life?
Sorry, I didn't get that. You were speaking so fast.
Okay, I'll say it again. What do you believe it means to truly live life to the fullest, And how has your journey so far influenced your overall outlook on life?
Do I believe in, I'm sorry, I'm just
What
stupid.
what do you believe it means to live life to the fullest, and
Ah,
how has your journey so far influenced your overall outlook on life?
okay. Well, there's some lines written by a poet which says, "Look thy last on all things lovely every hour." In other words, make use of every minute, live in the present, get the most out of every minute as you go through it, the most out of every day. Try and find meaning when something goes wrong. Sometimes you find meaning when you look back, like my boring old secretarial course. I look back and that led me into my new world that I wanted so badly. Um, so sometimes the setbacks and the trials and the problems actually help us to think a bit differently and help us on in the future. So try and make use of everything that happens and enjoy. Take time to enjoy. They say take time to smell the roses. A lot of people have done that during the pandemic. They've had time to sit back. I haven't. I've been busier than I've been in my entire life because everybody wants Jane to do a video message or to do a podcast or to do a interview, and I've been non-stop at it. Virtual Jane is busier than the other Jane.
Well, thank you for still coming and making the time to talk to us. Let's have Neil ask the next question.
Goodall. I wanted to ask what changes in the world and with public attitude towards environmentalism have you seen over the last 20 to 50 years? And what changes do you think we're going to see going forward into the future?
Well, the changes we've seen is a huge growth in awareness of what's going on. Because when I was young, we didn't think about the environment. It was really that need, as I said, there was an equatorial belt stretching unbroken forest right across Africa. Of course, from the dawn of history, we've harmed the environment, but it's only recently that as we've got more and more technology, that there's been a real change. And people are gradually becoming aware. I mean, there was a time when nobody knew what genetically modified food was. Now most people know. And so what must change after the pandemic as we move out? If we don't find a way of living in greater harmony with nature, if we don't find a new way forward, then we're on a downward path. And, we cannot go on harming the environment as we are now. We cannot go back to business as usual. And that's why it's so scary that some of the political leaders and business people are dying to get back to business as usual. We've got to find a new green economy. It's desperately important. A new way of rethinking our relationship with the natural world, because we're part of the natural world. We're not separated from it. We depend on it for our food, our clothes, clean air, clean water. It regulates the rainfall, it regulates the climate. And so, I will urge every single one of you listening, one thing you can do is plant a tree or raise money for people who are planting trees. So our group in Tanzania, little group of Roots and Shoots, several groups, have guaranteed they're going to plant 5 million trees in the next 12 months. And I think they will. So, yeah, we've got to think, and unfortunately, it's your world. We're leaving you a mess, but fortunately too, there's enough of us oldies who are passionate to help you and work with you and try and find the right way forward. But all these ideas, any ideas, we need everybody's ideas as to how we do this and how we get this green economy and how we think about success differently. And it relates to the last question. When too many people don't enjoy life, they're so busy making money, trying to make ends meet. We just need a different way of calming it down and doing with less and sharing more equally and creating the kind of world that you will be happy to leave to your grandchildren.
It's very important. And I think along those lines, Shweta has a question around the new normal. Shweta, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, right here. Sorry about that. Dr. Goodall, thank you so much for being with us. Truly an inspiration to me and my family. So my question was, sorry about this. What lesson about conservation and sustainability should we take from this pandemic and the current situation?
Well, I think I've probably answered it, haven't I? We should really take the fact that we brought it on ourselves to heart, and we should really, start thinking about how we can do it differently. And we will go on getting diseases from animals because inevitably we're moving closer and closer into their habitat as we destroy their habitat for our developments. So we're going to have to, on the one hand, think of how we can develop in a less intrusive way and give animals more space. And it's not a simple thing. It's going to need a lot of thought, but at least if more people are thinking in those terms and realizing, we need money to live. Most people do. But it goes wrong when you live for money, unless you're living to make money to help make the world a better place. We need people like that too. I need people like that. I'm always needing money to do some of our programs. And it's philanthropy and some of the great donors that I'm so grateful to. And after all, I started off because Louis Leakey got 6 months money from an American philanthropist called Leighton Wilkie. If he hadn't given me that money to start off, then there probably wouldn't have been a study. So we need those people. But too many people are making money just for themselves.
Wonderful. Why don't we go with Arushi's question next?
Hi, Dr. Goodall. It's such an honor to be hearing from you today. So I know that you're an inspiration to everyone on this call and people all around the world. So I'm curious, who is your inspiration, or who was your inspiration growing up?
Well, I've introduced you to my inspirations. My mother was an inspiration. There she is, my mother. And then my dog, Rusty, he was an inspiration to me. And then Dr. Dolittle and Tarzan, my grandmother. There was no TV, so we didn't have the sort of number of inspiring people that you guys have access to. So my inspirations came from books, and there weren't people out there doing the kind of things that would inspire me, like the David Attenboroughs and so on. So.
Great. Let's take one last question from the audience. So Bella, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks, Manal. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Goodall. You made it clear that your organization is rooted in community building from within rather than colonialist ideologies. This is such an important idea, and I'd love to get your advice on how young changemakers can ensure that they're taking into account and uplifting the experiences and voices in the community they work in, or even how this has made your organization more effective.
Could you hear that, Manat? Because it was
yeah, there was some feedback. Let me repeat her question.
Yeah,
so
it was feedback.
You would love to get your advice on how young change makers can ensure that they're taking into account and uplifting the experiences and voices in the communities that they work in.
Well, the answer to that, I think, is to listen to them and then try and weave what you've heard into the way that you're thinking. Maybe it doesn't always work that way, but if it does, I mean, when we work with our Takari program, we've got so many stories from the local people, the villagers, that are really inspiring. And one of my great reasons for hope is the indomitable human spirit, the people who tackle what seems to be impossible and won't give up and very often succeed. And you know, we could talk for hours about inspirational people like that, people suffering from tremendous physical disabilities and leading lives that are so inspiring. You know, it's I could talk a long time about that, but I won't because we're running out of time. And I have another interview after this.
Absolutely. So to wrap things up then, with Roots and Shoots, you've been very passionate about advocating for youth change makers. What do you believe is the power of young people to make an impact, and what advice would you give us?
Well, first of all, you are making an impact. I always say to people, it's not that young people can make a difference, they are making a difference. Change, sometimes in a very small way, sometimes just in their family. But it doesn't matter. Every little thing makes a difference. And you shouldn't think that you've got to make big change, especially now at your age. You've got to get experience, you've got to live, you've got to learn. Don't expect to make massive change. Now, you may make an invention that will lead to massive change, but don't be in a rush. Just take every day, think that every day is a gift, live it to the full. And if you make change along the way, that's great, but don't be in a rush at your age. Just let the things come, let the ideas come, and then see what happens.
That's beautiful advice, Dr. Goodall. I think to stay happy and also to make an impact. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your story today with us. I'm super inspired by all that you've done, and I know all the young change makers here are as well. So I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for letting me share my long years of experience with you all, and good luck to you all, and make change, but be happy.